Hey, good evening, you guys. This message is not brought to you by Exfoliage. Message is brought to you by the House of David Bible News. Urgent news. The Great Temple. The magnificent Temple of Jerusalem stood in a commanding position on top of the hill of Moriah and dominated the rest of the city of Jerusalem. The temple was first built soon after 1000 BC by King Solomon on the area traditionally remembered at the place where God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Since building, it had always been a place central to the Jewish faith. It was burned and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC and replaced about 70 years later by a more modest sanctuary built by Zerubbabel. Daily worship continued in this temple until the time of Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC, a time deeply imprinted in horror in Jewish memory. Antiochus Epiphanes, the ruler of the Seleucid Empire in Syria, of which Judea was then a part, stopped the worship of God of Israel and turned the temple over to the cult of the Olympian Zeus in an attempt to bring the Jews in line with the dominant Greek culture of the day. This lasted for 3 years before the revolt of Judas Maccabeus, and he was able to restore the traditional temple worship and rededicate the temple, which was the origin of the annual festival of Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication of the Temple. In about 20 BC, an ambitious rebuilding of the temple was undertaken by Herod the Great to restore it to its original Solomonic glory. He enlarged its precincts, which were surrounded by retaining walls of incomparable workmanship and great height. Just inside the walls were great colonnades or porticos, the most notable of which Solomon's portico, where Jesus sometimes taught in John 10 verse 23. Just to the west of the center of the enclosure stood the great temple building itself, surrounded by various courts. Directly around the building was the court of the priests, to which none but the priests were allowed to access. Then the court of Israel, the outside court of Israel, was the court of the women, which was as far as women were allowed to go, since they were prohibited from entering the central, more sacred area. All those courts were surrounded by stone lattice, which separated them from the court of the Gentiles outside. There were stone tablets set up at regular intervals along the outer lattice with Greek and Latin inscriptions warning the Gentiles not to go beyond the lattice on pain of death. Herod the Great renovated and enlarged these courts, and the sacred temple building itself was increased in height from 60 to 100 cubits. Much of the facade of the temple building, thanks to Herod, had been plated with gold, and its appearance was dazzling. Despite Herod's work, a certain amount of rebuilding and reconstruction was still going on in Jesus' day. Many priests had been trained in masonry and carpentry so that they could work in the consecrated area to which no layman had access. Yet, during all the time that construction work was carried on in the temple, ceremonial had never been interrupted, not even for a single hour. So great were the precautions taken that the work should be unobtrusive. Apart from the great festivals to which Jews came not only from all over Judea but also from all over the Mediterranean world, there was daily worship in the temple centering around the burnt offerings, at which a lamb was offered twice daily at daybreak and in the afternoon in the court of the priests. This was accompanied by choral singing and congregational prayers in Hebrew. In the court of the Gentiles, despite the sanctity of the temple area, there was a flourishing trade in sacrificial animals. There were shops where pilgrims who had come to Jerusalem to worship in the temple could buy oxen, sheep, and doves, which could then be offered up in appropriate sacrifices. It was naturally more convenient for the pilgrims to be able to buy within the precincts an animal already certified as suitable than to have to bring an animal with him, which would also have to undergo an official inspection. There were also tables where money changers changed money for payment of the annual temple tax. Most of the circulating currency in Judea was Roman money, and because such coins bore the portrait of the emperor, which the Jews considered unacceptable for sacred offerings because of the second commandment, it had to be changed into a special coinage which was the only legal fare for the temple dues. This profitable trade, which was supported by a powerful high priestly family of Annas and Caiaphas, was being held in the temple precincts in the court of the Gentiles for the first time. Customarily, there were 4 markets on the Mount of Olives, opposite which were considered a part of the temple precincts for ritual purposes, where pilgrims could buy ritually pure objects of sacrifice for temple offerings. These markets, however, which were of course extremely profitable, were under the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin and not of the high priest. So Caiaphas, the high priest, had introduced a sale of animals in the temple forecourt to set up a market in competition with the traditional markets on the Mount of Olives. Caiaphas had long been having a struggle for power and authority with the Sanhedrin, and this latest move gave him the chance of scooping an important financial gain over his enemies. It was this commercial use of the court of the Gentiles which prompted Jesus to take firm action. Urgent news, spring, 30 AD. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem was an occasion for great excitement for the crowds of pilgrims who were coming up to Jerusalem for the Passover. They clearly still entertained hopes that Jesus would lead the people as a triumphant Messiah. Although there was a variety of expectations about the nature of the Messiah, the most widespread popular belief was that the Messiah would be another David, a military leader who would defeat the Romans and restore sovereign Jewish nation under God's rule. Jesus rejected such an idea of the Messiah as too narrow in outlook and doomed to failure. God's kingdom is to transcend national boundaries. It is to be God's rule over the lives of men everywhere. The hopes that Jesus would lead the people as a triumphant Messiah were increased by the dramatic raising of Lazarus from the dead at Bethany. Jesus' previous miracles of raising the dead were in Galilee and would probably have passed largely unnoticed in Jerusalem. Such excitement surrounding Jesus was a cause of concern to the Sanhedrin. They were afraid that any popular uprising which would lead to sharp Roman reprisals. Indeed, such fears were not unjustified. The revolt of 66 to 70 AD led to the burning of Jerusalem, the temple, and the complete destruction of the nation by the Romans.